In the quiet suburbs of Niigata in 1990, a teenage girl walked home beneath a gray winter sky. She carried no secrets, no plans for vanishing, just the ordinary way of school books and a promise to be home for dinner. But she never arrived. To the world, she had evaporated into snow and silence. 9 years later, behind the locked doors of a seemingly harmless house, the missing time was found, thousands of days stolen, compressed into a single airless room. The police had stopped searching. The newspapers had long forgotten. But Fusako Sano had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, the prisoner of a man whose cruelty thrived on the world's indifference. This isn't just a story of a kidnapping. It's the story of how an entire society walked past a locked room, day after day, and chose not to see. A radio crackled in the small town of Sanjo, Niigata Prefecture, on the night of January 28, 2000. The announcer read from the police blotter, "A missing girl has been found alive." That alone should have been a miracle, a relief. But the words that followed didn't sound like salvation. They sounded like a warning. She was held captive for nearly 9 years. 9 years, 3,364 days. While the world shifted through recessions, booming pop idols, and technological revolutions, one young woman was locked away in a suffocating room, her life compressed into a single airless corner of hell. The survivor's name was Fusako Sano, and she had been just 10 years old when she vanished in the streets of Niigata. Her rescue was almost accidental, stumbled upon during a completely unrelated police intervention. The authorities stormed the home of a man named Nobuyuki Sato, a local recluse, not because they suspected him of holding a child captive, but because he had assaulted someone else. When they pushed past his cluttered front room, they found a figure hiding in the shadows, pale and trembling, speaking in whispers that sounded like the echo of a child frozen in time. She introduced herself as Fusako, but her voice was rusted with disuse. Imagine being stripped from your life at 10 and spat back into it as an adult without the natural rhythm of growth. While her classmates were preparing for university exams and finding part-time jobs, she was learning again how to stand under sunlight without squinting, how to talk to another human without shrinking into herself. The chilling part isn't just the crime, it's the ordinariness of the place. Sato's house wasn't some remote shack in a mountain forest. It sat in plain view on a quiet street among neighbors who mowed lawns, sorted trash for recycling, and went about daily life. For nearly a decade, Fusako lived less than 100 steps from people who could have heard her breathing through the walls. A child's life was devoured inside a cage masquerading as a home. A city walked past, oblivious. And when the door finally opened, what came out wasn't simply a girl. It was the embodiment of years we can't account for, a human calendar that had been blacked out day by day. The question remains, how does a crime of this scale, this horror, remain hidden in plain sight for nearly 10 years? The answer is buried in Japan's fractured trust and authority, in a man's obsession spiraling unchecked, and in a society that struggles to reconcile shame with action. And so, we begin in the suffocating silence of a locked room, a silence that lasted 3,364 days too long. Japan in the early 1990s. Let me paint it for you, not with cherry blossoms and kimonos, but with the sound of an economy crashing in slow motion. The bubble had burst. Stock prices tumbled, real estate collapsed, and suddenly the future wasn't a straight path to prosperity, but a foggy, twisting alley. Families that had once believed in the unshakable promise of stability began to fracture under invisible pressures. In towns like Sanjo, Niigata Prefecture, you could feel that quiet unease. The streets were not barren, not dangerous, but heavy in their stillness. People whisper about rising unemployment, about middle-aged men losing themselves to pachinko parlors and alcohol, about children left unattended as parents clawed at second jobs. The air itself carried something brittle. Japan, for all its discipline and order, has a shadow stitched into its fabric. The unspoken rule of shikata genai. It can't be helped. Problems it tucked away, behind sliding doors, behind frosted glass, behind layers of silence, so thick that sometimes entire tragedies rot there unnoticed. Domestic disputes, hidden abuse, social withdrawal. They become ghosts haunting ordinary neighborhoods. The 1990s were also a decade of cult paranoia. Remember Aum Shinrikyo, the doomsday group that unleashed sarin gas in the Tokyo subway in 1995? That single event poisoned public trust. If a crime wasn't spectacular, if it didn't splatter across newspapers in big type, it was easy to ignore, and so smaller horrors festered. In Niigata, the winters are brutal. Snow blankets the town like a smothering quilt, burying cars, muting footsteps, silencing the world. That silence is both beautiful and terrifying, a perfect cloak for secrets. Imagine a girl trapped in a locked room, staring through the frost-patterned glass, listening to the muffled crunch of neighbors' boots outside, close enough to touch but impossibly far away. The police of the time, let's be honest, were not built for vigilance. They were bureaucratic machines, sluggish and prideful, far more comfortable cracking down on bicycle theft than investigating vanishings. A missing child could easily be filed under probably a runaway, because that was simpler, cleaner, required less shame for the community to acknowledge. And Niigata, though quiet, was not innocent. People knew how to avert their eyes, how to preserve the fragile illusion of normalcy, because to admit that something monstrous was happening next door was to stain everyone with its horror. This was a stage, a society fraying at the edges, still clinging formality while looking away from cracks. A small town wrapped in snowdrifts, a police force asleep at the wheel. And into this muted world, a girl named Fusako Sano stepped into the wrong place at the wrong time, vanishing into the void that would swallow nearly a decade of her life. Fusako Sano. Her name doesn't thunder like some legendary martyr. It whispers. A quiet, ordinary girl, born in 1981, raised in Niigata, where the seasons are merciless but predictable. She wasn't the type of child people etched into memory. No scandal, no rebellion, no oddities. Just a 10-year-old with straight black hair and the kind of shy demeanor that folds on itself like origami. Her classmates remember her as timid, polite, someone who avoided the spotlight. Teachers describe her as average, which in Japanese context is practically a compliment. It means she fit in, she followed rules, she didn't disturb the harmony. That's the tragedy of it. She could have been any child. She could have been a girl in your neighborhood, the one walking home with a school bag bouncing against her side. On November 13th, 1990, Fusako disappeared. 10 years old, on her way home after attending a baseball game. That was it. A few minutes of unguarded walking, the briefest sliver of vulnerability, and she was gone. Her life ended in the sense of continuity. We measure lives in milestones, but hers broke into before and after that night. The image of Fusako that lingers is strange. Not the girl she was, but the woman she became inside captivity. Pale, fragile, her voice small, vocabulary stunted. When neighbors finally glimpsed her years later, some describe her as looking younger than her actual age, as though time itself had paused at 10 and refused to move forward. And yet, she was not a ghost. She was a human being with the weight of 3,364 days pressing down on her shoulders. What does that do to a mind? A child learns by play, by touch, by failure and recovery. But she was denied all of it. Her curriculum was isolation. Her textbooks, the whims of a captor. She learned silence as a language. She learned fear as oxygen. It's tempting to paint her purely as a symbol of tragedy. But Fusako survived. That survival is not neat, not heroic in a Hollywood sense. It is ragged, complicated, soaked in scars we can't see. Survival in her story was endurance without choice. She didn't fight her captor in some dramatic battle. She endured him the cruelest way imaginable. Day after day, without escape, without relief. Before captivity, she was just a girl. After captivity, she was a living question mark. A human reminder of how fragile safety is, how quickly ordinary can collapse into nightmare. Fusako Sano is not remembered because of who she was before. She is remembered because she became the embodiment of stolen years, of a crime so intimate it feels almost impossible to believe it happened in plain sight. November 13th, 1990. The night Fusako's life vanished into a fold of shadow. She had been to a baseball game, a perfectly innocent outing. The kind of memory children should carry with them like a badge of joy. But the stadium lights faded, the crowd thinned, and the journey home began. The dangerous interlude nobody thinks about until it's too late. She was last seen walking along a familiar stretch of road in Sanjo, 10 years old, carrying that oversized school bag every Japanese child seems to lug like a second skeleton. A kid in the middle of the school week, full of routines, and then silence. Her mother waited at home, probably watching the clock in 5-minute intervals, listening for the thud of footsteps in the hallway. But those footsteps never came. Instead, what arrived was absence, a ringing absence that set off alarms in the deepest part of the brain. Parents know that feeling, the instant dread when a child doesn't appear on schedule. The first search was frantic. Family members scoured the streets. Neighbors were asked. The police were called. But the explanation came too quickly, too easily. Maybe she ran away. Maybe she wandered off and would be back soon. That assumption, poisonous in its complacency, would haunt everything that followed. What nobody knew then was that Fusako had been snatched by a man named Nobuyuki Sato, a man who on the surface was unremarkable, unemployed, socially awkward, known for erratic outbursts. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was ordinary in the most unnerving way, the sort of neighbor you avoid eye contact with but don't fear enough to report. And yet, in that moment of weakness, a 10-year-old walking alone, he saw opportunity. He pulled her into his car. No dramatic chase, no screams that pierced the night sky. Just a quick abduction in a quiet neighborhood where people were too polite, too oblivious, or too unwilling to intervene. The disturbance wasn't a storm. It wasn't fireworks. It was a single match being struck in a locked room, its flame consuming years unnoticed. The horror was how smoothly it blended into the silence of everyday life. When the police wrote runaway in their reports, they unknowingly sealed her fate. For nearly a decade, every assumption, every dismissal, every bureaucratic shrug, each was a brick in the wall that kept her hidden. This was the fracture line, the first disturbance. A child's disappearance collapsing into nothing more than paperwork, while she was already being dragged into the belly of her captor's ordinary-looking home. For most families, the hours after a disappearance stretched like rubber bands. Painful, elastic, but ultimately finite. Someone sees something. A clue surfaces. The story moves forward. For the Sano family, the hours bled into days, and the days into years. And each passing season carved deeper grooves of despair into their lives. The police insisted on the runaway theory. 10-year-old girls don't usually run away, but that didn't stop the bureaucratic machinery from grinding toward convenience. No ransom notes, no demands, no witnesses, so the file began collecting dust. This is where the story twists from tragedy into absurdity. While the Sano family pleaded for answers, investigators chose to protect their pride instead of pursuing the uncomfortable truth. They didn't want another unsolved case, staining their reputation. And so Fusako disappeared twice. once in the street and once from the system designed to find her. The rumors didn't help. In small towns, gossip metastasizes in conspiracy with terrifying speed. Some whispered she had been abducted by strangers, others that she had drowned, others still that she had slipped into a cult. Aum Shinrikyo had burned itself into the public consciousness. Any unexplained absence was pinned on invisible networks of zealots lurking in shadows. It was easier somehow to imagine a girl swallowed by a mysterious organization than to face the possibility that she was trapped in someone's ordinary-looking home just down the block. Meanwhile, the Sano household became a mausoleum of what-ifs. Her mother clung to the idea that Fusako was alive, somewhere, waiting, but hope corrodes when it has no foundation. Every knock on the door could have been news. Every time the phone rang, her heart must have split open. And yet, year after year, the sound was only silence, or worse, false leads that ended in nothing. Here's the part that claws at me. While the world was inventing theories, Fusako herself was still there, living, breathing, waiting, just meters from the people searching for her. She could hear the ordinary sounds of neighbors, laughter, dishes clinking, children shouting as they played outside, while she sat inside her captor's home, the walls closing in like padded coffins. And as the years stacked up, the mystery grew heavier. A missing girl who never resurfaced, no remains, no sightings, no solid leads. She had become almost mythological, an absence that haunted the town like a ghost story parents told to scare their kids indoors before dark. But Fusako wasn't a ghost. She was still enduring, unseen, while her name transformed into a puzzle no one thought could be solved. If you want a masterclass in how not to investigate a disappearance, look no further than the Fusako Sano case. The Niigata police didn't just drop the ball. They buried it, built a shrine over it, and pretended it never existed. Their investigation was a bureaucratic theater. A few canvases, some perfunctory questioning, then a quick pivot to the all-purpose cop-out. She must have run away. Case closed. Theories filled the void left by their failure. Some believe Fusako had been snatched by passing criminals, trafficked into the underworld like a phantom swallowed by Tokyo's neon-lit sprawl. Others swore cults were involved. This was the mid-90s, after all, when Aum Shinrikyo had left Japan paralyzed with paranoia. Even wild rumors of UFO abduction cropped up in whispers, because when the truth is unimaginable, people grasp at anything. But the most sinister possibility, the one that was true, was the least considered, that she was hidden in plain sight, trapped behind the walls of an ordinary home. Nobody wanted to believe it. That kind of horror was reserved for movies, for Western true crime headlines, not for their quiet neighborhood. Meanwhile, Nobuyuki Sato was spiraling into his own personal madness. A socially withdrawn man in his 20s when he kidnapped Fusako, Sato was known for volatile outbursts, for erratic behavior that made neighbors uneasy. He was unemployed, still living with his elderly mother. But eccentricity in Japan is often treated with avoidance, not confrontation. People muttered about him, but kept their distance. Because in a culture where harmony trumps conflict, calling attention to someone's oddness feels almost taboo. Sato turned that invisibility into armor. Inside his home, he created a secret prison. Fusako was confined to a small room, forbidden from leaving, conditioned into silence. He wasn't sophisticated. He was sloppy, erratic, but his very mediocrity protected him. No one suspected the house across the street from theirs could contain a living missing person. The investigation floundered so badly that years later, when Fusako was finally found, the public outrage wasn't just at Sato, it was at the police. Citizens were horrified by the idea that law enforcement had been so uninterested, so careless, that a child could be hidden for nearly a decade without even a whisper of suspicion. Theories about cover-ups and incompetence surged, and frankly, they weren't entirely wrong. The haunting contradiction is this. The truth was simple. She wasn't in another prefecture. She wasn't dead. She wasn't with a cult. She was right there, suffocating under the nose of her entire community. Theories multiplied because the obvious answer was too bleak to accept, that society itself had looked away. It didn't happen because of some brilliant detective. It didn't happen because the police suddenly remembered their duty. The breakthrough came from chaos, from a completely different crime that cracked open the door. January 2000. Nearly a decade had passed since Fusako's disappearance, and the town had moved on, or at least it had convinced itself it had. Nobuyuki Sato, the man who had stolen Fusako's life, snapped in public. He assaulted a man during a road rage incident, an outburst so violent that the police, finally, had no choice but to intervene, and so they came to his house. Not with the intention of uncovering a hidden captive. No, they were just following up on the assault, business as usual. But when officers stepped inside, they didn't just find a cluttered, suffocating home. They found her, a woman crouched, trembling, with a voice that barely reached above a whisper. "I am Fusako Sano." Imagine the surreal silence in that room. A missing child, presumed gone for nearly 10 years. Suddenly alive, suddenly here, introducing herself to men who had failed to look for her. For a moment, it must have felt like staring at a ghost who decided to step back into flesh. But the revelation was not clean, not cinematic. Fusako was not rescued in triumph. She was dragged out of years of psychological ruin. Her captor's grip wasn't physical chains. It was fear conditioning, the slow erosion of her will. She had been told to stay quiet, to stay hidden, and for nearly a decade she obeyed. She wasn't free when they found her. Freedom was something she'd have to relearn. The turning point wasn't just a discovery. It was a collapse of illusions. The neighbors who lived beside Sato's house were forced to face the unbearable truth. The girl they had pitted in gossip, theorized about, even forgotten, had been right there the entire time. The police, humiliated, had to admit their incompetence in the most public way possible. And Sato, the man at the center of this vortex of cowardice and cruelty, he didn't even fight when Fusako was found. His breakdown came almost immediately after. Stripped of his secret, exposed as not a genius manipulator, but a pathetic man clinging to power he never deserved, he collapsed under questioning, his bizarre behavior unraveling in plain sight. The case shattered the myth that horrors only happen in hidden corners. The turning point was not a glorious rescue, but an ugly unveiling. The monster wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in alleys. He was a neighbor with the sagging curtains, the one everyone muttered about but never confronted. On paper, the resolution should have been simple. Girl found, captor arrested, justice served. Reality, as always, was messier. Fusako Sano had been discovered alive, yes, but the girl who reemerged was not the same child who disappeared in 1990. She was 19 by then, biologically an adult, but she spoke and moved like someone still frozen in childhood. Her vocabulary was stunted. Her body was frail. She had been starved not just of food, but of time itself. Neighbors who glimpsed her described her as timid, like a little girl trapped inside an older body. The rescue wasn't a triumphant reunion. It was a surreal, almost heartbreaking reintroduction. Sato, her captor, was arrested and interrogated. The world wanted to believe this was a clean villain story. An evil man punished, a girl freed. But Sato himself was far from a criminal mastermind. He was a deeply unstable man, erratic, unemployed, dependent on his elderly mother, a recluse with a penchant for violent outbursts. In many ways, he was a symptom of Japan's collapsing social safety nets, an unmoored man whose sickness was allowed to fester in silence until it consumed someone else. The trial should have answered questions, but it raised new ones. Why hadn't the police searched Sato's house earlier? Why had they clung so stubbornly to the runaway theory? Why had neighbors ignored the oddities, the locked windows, the strange noises, the withdrawn family? And why, above all, had Fusako herself not screamed, not tried to escape, not pounded on walls that stood only a few feet from the outside world? The answer lies in something darker than physical chains. Sano had used fear and conditioning as his weapons. He told Fusako that if she tried to escape, terrible consequences would follow for her family. He created a psychological prison so complete that she stayed quiet even when freedom was only a doorway. It wasn't laziness or weakness. It was survival through submission, the cruel logic of someone who had been a child when the rules of her reality were rewritten. So, yes, the resolution came. Sano was taken into custody. Fusako was returned to her family. On paper, the missing girl case was closed, but lingering questions hung in the air like smoke after fire. Could this have been prevented? How many other lives were being quietly swallowed in the same silence? The case didn't resolve with clarity. It resolved with unease. A man was caught. A woman was freed, but the society that allowed it all to happen remained exposed, uncomfortably naked in its complicity. When Fusako returned home, Niigata didn't erupt in celebration. It froze. The newspapers blared the miracle of her survival, but behind the headlines was an uncomfortable truth. The community hadn't saved her. They had lived their lives within arm's reach of her prison, and not one of them had lifted the veil. It was less a homecoming than an indictment. The aftermath was brutal, not just for Sano, but for the institutions supposed to prevent tragedies like this. The Niigata police faced public fury. Citizens demanded to know why. In nearly a decade, they hadn't once searched the house of a known, unstable man living right in town. The label of runaway became a scarlet mark of incompetence, proof of how bureaucratic laziness can ruin lives. Investigations into the police force revealed systemic issues: pride, denial, and an aversion to admitting mistakes. This single case became shorthand for everything broken in Japanese policing during the 1990s. Fusako herself carried the heaviest weight. The world wanted a narrative of resilience, but survival doesn't translate into healing overnight. She had to relearn how to speak comfortably, how to walk into sunlight, how to exist in a society that had aged without her. Imagine emerging into a world where your peers are preparing for university entrance exams while you're still emotionally in elementary school. Every birthday she had missed, every milestone skipped, hung over her like unmarked gravestones. Japan reeled. The case fed a national conversation about hikikomori, the phenomenon of reclusive men shutting themselves in their rooms for years, supported by aging parents. Sano was not exactly a textbook hikikomori, but his isolation echoed the pattern. Social failure, retreat into the home, festering paranoia. Fusako's story forced Japan to look at the dangers hidden behind shut doors and shuttered windows. Legal reforms limped forward. The police were pressured into changing how missing person cases were classified. Awareness campaigns about abductions began cropping up in schools. But the reforms never quite matched the scale of the horror, because this wasn't just about systems. It was about silence. The silence of neighbors, the silence of authorities, the silence Fusako herself was forced into. The legacy of her 3,364 days of captivity is paradoxical. On one hand, she survived against odds so bleak they make your skin crawl. On the other, her survival exposed wounds far larger than her own. Wounds in policing, in community trust, in the way Japanese society buries its shame. And perhaps the cruelest part of all, the case became infamous not because of her individuality, but because of its grotesque duration. Fusako Sano, the girl, became Fusako Sano, the symbol. And symbols, unlike people, are hard to set free. 3,364 days. Count them. Not in theory. Really try. Day 1, Day 2, Day 3. By Day 50, your nerves are already shredded. By Day 200, you're a ghost. By year 3, the calendar loses meaning. And yet, Fusako lived through nearly a decade of that suspended time. The number is obscene, almost abstract. But behind every digit is a sunrise she didn't see, a birthday that evaporated, a future that folded in on itself like a crumpled letter. What terrifies me most isn't Sato's cruelty. It's the way ordinary silence collaborated with him. The police officer who scribbled "runaway" on the report. The neighbor who shrugged at Sato's oddness. The friends and classmates who grew up and moved on. Because what else could they do? It wasn't one monster. It was 1,000 tiny acts of inaction, weaving a cocoon that kept her invisible. And this is where the story curdles into something more than a crime report. It becomes a mirror. How many people are swallowed every day by rooms we choose not to look into? How many Fusakos are still out there, tucked behind walls too ordinary to arouse suspicion? We comfort ourselves with the belief that monsters announce themselves with fangs and blood. But no, sometimes they water their plants, nod politely, and close their doors just like the rest of us. Fusako did survive, but survival is not the same as restoration. She will always carry those missing years as phantom limbs, invisible but heavy. And society, too, carries its own scar, the shame of having been complicit through neglect. If there's one lesson carved into this case, it's that silence is not neutral. Silence is fertile soil where cruelty thrives. The locked room wasn't just in Sato's house. It was in the minds of everyone who looked away. And maybe that's the most chilling thought of all. The next locked room could be next door or across the street, and the only thing keeping you from noticing is the comfort of not asking questions. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.